Hi there, everybody. I'm Jeff Maris from WisPolitics.com here with a virtual event with Wisconsin's Attorney General Josh Kaul. But first, want to get some business out of the way. Want to promote our directory. If you haven't received our printed directory, you can do so by messaging info@wispolitics.com and asking how to receive our printed directory, our annual printed directory. Want to thank our sponsors for this event series. We usually hold these at the Madison Club, but we've been doing a lot of virtual events because of the pandemic, and this one was scheduled as a virtual event, so we kept it that way. But we are back to doing in-person events at the Madison Club. Want to thank our sponsors: Hush Blackwell Strategies, American Family Insurance, Xcel Energy, Walmart, ARP Wisconsin, and Anthem. So now I want to introduce to you the Attorney General of the state of Wisconsin in his first term, Josh Kaul. Welcome, Mr. Attorney General. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Of course. So breaking news, literally, just before we came on the air today. I think a surprise, the U.S. Supreme Court is getting involved in Wisconsin's redistricting battle. It ruled that it would nixed the state legislative maps, but kept in place the congressional maps. I'm not exactly sure what happens now, but I'm glad we have an expert on board to tell us what's going on and what's your analysis and what happens now.
Yeah, I think it's pretty shocking to see this ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think it's frankly consistent with the increasing activism we've seen from the conservative supermajority on the U.S. Supreme Court. There have been several other states whose maps have been challenged, and the court had consistently said that it was too late in the process to require courts or legislatures to redraw maps, but apparently they've reached a different conclusion here in Wisconsin. They said that this needs to go back to the state Supreme Court. So now there's going to have to be a new process in place. We're already past the date when the Election Commission had asked to have maps settled. And so this is going to create some real complications for our election process. And I think what we're going to see is a flurry of court action coming out of this regarding what the next round of maps will look like.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. Supreme Court, I mean, there was a Wisconsin case that, went to the U.S. Supreme Court and other cases from other states a few years ago. And the court basically said, we're not getting involved in, redistricting. That's going to be up to the states. And then we saw some appeals being rejected and state maps being kept in place. What makes this one different, do you think? Or, any inkling?
It's hard to say. The majority laid out some reasons that they think that they needed to get involved here, but I think the dissent made some very persuasive points about how unusual this order is. I believe the dissent referred to it as unprecedented. They seem to want the state Supreme Court, that is, to dive further into the facts of the underlying decisions that were made for the maps. And it's frankly an example of why this case is not well suited for the state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court, because, if you're going to really dig into those facts, you need to have hearings, you need to have witnesses, and that usually happens in front of a trial court. So we'll see what process the state Supreme Court decides to go with and whether the federal courts get further involved. But it's now created massive uncertainty going forward.
Yeah, so the federal courts kind of yielded to the state Supreme Court, and so I'm wondering, because I think the Voting Rights Act and Black majority districts are referenced here, that would seem to fall into the federal court's jurisdiction more so than the state Supreme Court. And I'm wondering, could we see the federal courts more involved now from here on in, the lower federal courts?
I think that remains to be seen. I suspect there will be litigation over what should happen next. And I think we'll likely hear from the courts, the state Supreme Court, a request for the parties to lay out a process. In creating these maps, the state Supreme Court asked for a briefing on what the process should look like. This is the process we ended up with, and apparently the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't think it was sufficient. So we're going to be back to the drawing board on this, and I think there's going to be a lot of litigation ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people don't care about elected officials and filing deadlines and stuff, but I mean, there is a window that needs to be reached in terms of candidates filing their papers, and this could delay all that. So yeah, so that's a big surprise, and we'll see what happens. Thanks for weighing in on that. So I wanted to, okay, so most people think of the Attorney General, for better or for worse, as the state's top cop. Okay, and maybe that's media's fault, but you do a lot of different things. But in this realm, I mean, in fact, there was an article in the New York Times today trying to explain what's going on. And I think that criminologists are trying to figure it out. I mean, the nation's enduring a crime wave. It's not unique to Milwaukee, not unique to Wisconsin. It's not just murders. It's other violent crimes. And I'm wondering how your office is grappling with it, what your explanations are for what's going on, because I think it's obviously puts a lot of people ill at ease.
Yeah, my top priority as Attorney General is public safety, and we work to protect public safety in a number of different ways at Wisconsin DOJ. What we've seen over the last couple of years, really since the pandemic hit, is a spike in all different kinds of antisocial behaviors, and that includes violent crimes and shootings. We've also seen a lot of increased substance use disorder and overdose deaths, and even things like air rage incidents we've seen more of, and reckless driving. And it's clear that the pandemic is causing a lot of these underlying problems, whether it's mental health issues, again, substance use disorder, or just disconnection between people and social isolation. What I think we need to do is make sure that we are investing in the kinds of things that can make our communities safer, and investing in our communities in general. When I took office as Attorney General, one of the topics I mentioned in my inaugural remarks was the need to finally fund our criminal justice system adequately again after decades of underfunding. And we've made some notable progress on those issues. There have been about 70 prosecutors added around the state. There's been some additional funding for law enforcement training in Wisconsin, but we need to do a lot more. And that's why in November, I put out the Safer Wisconsin Plan, which proposes a $115 million investment in public safety in Wisconsin, including additional funding for law enforcement recruiting and retention, additional funding for community policing, as well as additional funding to help with crisis response so we can respond to mental health crises more effectively, and a number of other programs that can make communities safer.
Okay, you mentioned law enforcement funding. I mean, you're a Democrat, and Republicans have been labeling Democrats as wanting to defund the police. Biden's fought against that notion, and so has Governor Evers. What's your response to, again, there are some people who truly believe defunding the police and reorganizing the police, reorganizing public safety could improve the situation. What's your view on that? Because you mentioned that in your response there.
No, I don't support defunding the police. Law enforcement is the backbone of our public safety efforts, and we need to provide more funding to law enforcement, not less. I have advocated, as I mentioned, throughout my term for additional funding, both for DOJ and for law enforcement in Wisconsin. Unfortunately, a number of the requests we've made for additional funding that would support law enforcement efforts at DOJ have been rejected by the state legislature. And so far, our Safer Wisconsin plan hasn't been taken up. But I would like to see the legislature take that issue up. They've indicated that they're going to wait till the next budget to approve new spending, which is more than a year from now. I'd like to see them take action to address the public safety challenges that we face right now. And so I hope that they will take another look at Safer Wisconsin and look to make our communities safer.
Okay, well, you submit a budget, but, the governor, submits a budget, but where should the funding come from? Should it come from the Fed? Should it come from the state? Should it come from the locals? I mean, locals are complaining about not getting a shared revenue increase for many years in Wisconsin, and they fund a lot of police work that way. I mean, where should the money come from?
I think it should come from a mix of places, and we're seeing some of those areas come through and some that we haven't. So the governor has a large volume of COVID relief funds to distribute. I joined him in Milwaukee when he announced a $45 million investment in victim services and in violence prevention efforts. And then I joined him recently when he announced additional funding for law enforcement, for treatment programs, and for the court system, among other things. So that was a significant step in the right direction. We also have been working at DOJ to hold Big Pharma accountable for its role in the opioid epidemic. And we're going to have about $400 million coming to the state of Wisconsin, including $50 million this year to support efforts to fight the opioid epidemic. But we also need the legislature to step up. We've got about a $3.8 billion surplus, and investing at least a portion of that surplus into making our communities safer, I think would be money very well spent by the state.
Okay, well, let's talk about that opioid crisis. So it's you're getting this money, but it's not, fighting the opioid crisis. Isn't this money, a lot of it have to do with treatment and rehab and preventing people from getting back on opioids?
It can go to a number of purposes relating to fighting the opioid epidemic. About 70% of the funds are going to go to counties and local governments in Wisconsin. The other 30% will go to the Department of Health Services. That was pursuant to a state law. And what's going to happen with that is that counties, local governments, and DHS will make decisions about how to spend those funds. They need to be used in ways that can abate the opioid epidemic, but that could be anything from treatment and prevention programs, which I hope we will see more of, but it can also include enforcement efforts and funding efforts to slow the supply of dangerous drugs to Wisconsin.
At the same time, you're trying to help victims of opioid addiction. You're trying to do more to investigate drug crimes as well. There was a release out yesterday about your prosecutors making a big impact in Wisconsin. Explain, I guess, this effort, and then maybe how it fits with the other effort.
Yeah, I spent part of my career as a federal prosecutor in Baltimore. I was in the narcotics section there, and I worked on cases involving large-scale drug trafficking. And from my experience, what I can tell you is that the best way to disrupt the flow of dangerous drugs like fentanyl and heroin is to conduct the kind of long-term intensive investigations that don't just result in a single arrest, but that can dismantle a drug trafficking operation. We have a couple regional drug prosecutors at the Wisconsin Department of Justice who work with law enforcement and DA's offices around the state to do those kinds of cases, to make sure that when information comes in, that we are working our way up the chain of supply and holding the most dangerous offenders accountable. That's a bipartisan program. It was started under the prior Attorney General. I've continued it. It has the support from both Democratic and Republican DAs in Wisconsin, but the funding is going to end soon. And so I'm hopeful that we will see the legislature provide continued funding for those positions so that our regional drug prosecutors can continue to do the important work that they do to fight the drug epidemic.
Okay, I think, the public maybe there's a larger decriminalization effort too for those who may have been convicted of drug crimes, maybe decades ago. The governor's pardoning some of these folks. The U.S. Supreme Court nominee has a relative who was is serving or has served a long term for a cocaine charge. And I guess, how does the decriminalization effort or the effort to right certain wrongs in terms of overarching drug prosecution, I guess, fit in with these things that we're talking about now?
Yeah, I think there are two things that I would mention. One is, there has been a move in a number of states to change their laws regarding marijuana. And here in Wisconsin, we haven't had any significant change. My view is that we should legalize medical marijuana. I think that it is safer for people to use medical marijuana than an opioid. We've certainly seen the dangers of opioid addiction. And we've seen in other states they've taken that step without negative consequences to public safety. But my view is that the approach that we should take should be driven by public safety considerations. I think it's also true that in some places, particularly some decades ago, there was a focus on people who were using the drugs as targets of investigation and prosecution. I think that our resources need to be primarily focused on drug traffickers, the people who are distributing these dangerous drugs like heroin and fentanyl and meth, and making sure that we are holding those folks accountable as we're making decisions about how to use limited resources.
All right, how big of a problem is that in Wisconsin? I guess the manufacturers, the traffickers, the big time traffickers, and I guess, is it a homegrown thing or is it an imported problem? What's your analysis and data show?
It is a significant problem in Wisconsin. It's a significant problem across the United States. And it's a problem that has evolved a bit over the years. The opioid epidemic was ushered in by companies like Purdue Pharma selling opioids over the counter or through prescriptions, and people then became addicted. We've made some significant progress in improving prescription practices and making the public aware of the dangers of opioids, even if they're prescribed. But what we've seen is a big influx of illegal opioids, including heroin, illegal fentanyl, and fentanyl is incredibly potent and dangerous. And it's been used in combination with some other drugs. So it's been causing overdoses from some folks who don't even realize that they're taking fentanyl. We've also got meth coming into the state. The meth we see in Wisconsin, as well as the illegal heroin and fentanyl, is coming from outside the state. There's the occasional meth lab in Wisconsin, but generally the meth is coming from outside the state. And so working to dismantle those trafficking networks that are bringing drugs across state lines, often across national borders, is critical to slowing the supply of those drugs.
Okay, so if I understand this right, the traffickers in meth, fentanyl, heroin are preying upon people who got addicted through big pharma. That's what you're saying.
That's one of the things that's happening. People who were addicted to opioids decide to try to obtain other opioids illegally. Now, there are also people who become addicted in other ways, certainly. So we've got to make sure we're addressing both issues, but we are making progress when it comes to the addiction part. Although I would note that the prescription rates for opioids are still far, far higher than they were 20 or 25 years ago.
Yeah, and isn't the opioid addiction crisis has risen during COVID, has it not? I mean, that's the pandemic we weren't paying attention to.
That's right. I think the things we've seen, like social isolation and mental health challenges, have also led to increased substance use disorder. That's, I think, part of what's going on. But the other part is that fentanyl is driving a huge increase in overdose deaths because it's so potent and so dangerous. This is something people are seeing around the country. So the more that we can do to slow the supply of fentanyl, and also to make sure that people are getting into treatment programs and recovery programs so that they're not putting their lives at risk by taking illegal narcotics, the safer our communities are going to be.
Okay, so if this is coming from outside Wisconsin, so isn't it a federal issue?
It's both a state and a federal issue. We work together in partnership with federal law enforcement agencies and with local law enforcement agencies. And we've got to make sure both that we're effectively working on cross-state cases, but also that here in Wisconsin, when there are traffickers in Wisconsin who are responsible for selling fentanyl and meth and heroin and other dangerous drugs, that they're being investigated and prosecuted.
All right, any more on you've got a lot to cover here, but anything more on that, the drug issues or anything else you want to add on that?
Well, we got to keep making sure that we're holding Big Pharma accountable for its role. I mentioned the $400 million that's coming into the state. There will be potentially other recoveries that remains to be seen. There's ongoing a case involving bankruptcy for Purdue Pharma, for example. But continuing to make sure that our law enforcement agencies have the resources they need and that we're funding treatment, diversion, and recovery programs, that's going to be what helps us turn the tide on this epidemic.
Yeah, this money is, this era's tobacco settlement money. It could be a game changer. I hope so. Okay, on to some other things that I think are happening during your tenure as Attorney General. As I said, you're in your first term. So you launched an investigation on sex abuse amongst clergy. Some people, I often got like, why is he doing that? Isn't that kind of like an old thing? And if you're running for re-election, that seems like a kind of a difficult subject. But anyway, why did you launch that investigation and what's the status of it?
Yeah, well, we won't launch this for a few reasons. The biggest one is that there has never been a statewide independent review of clergy and faith leader abuse in Wisconsin. At the time we launched our review, over 20 other states had done so, and a lot of those investigations uncovered significant evidence of abuse that hadn't previously been reported, and in some cases, prosecutions were able to go forward because of those reviews. And the lack of an independent review in Wisconsin has led to a few different issues. One is it's prevented people from going through the healing process that a survivor would go through if they had gotten the support that they need. Some of these are cases where people went to a trusted adult and rather than getting the support that they should have gotten, had their cases swept under the rug. Another important issue is to connect victims with services so that victims who are still dealing with trauma can get the help that they need. And then last, we wanted to make sure that whatever accountability was available was pursued. So we, a few months ago, announced that we'd received over 180 reports from people who were providing information about clergy and faith leader abuse. We recently announced that the first prosecution to result from a report to our hotline had taken place. So there's now a person who's been charged. And we have multidisciplinary teams that are reviewing every report that's been submitted to DOJ. So we are continuing with this process. And again, our goal is to focus on those three areas: providing accountability where we can, to promote healing where possible, and to connect survivors with services, and ultimately to prevent this from ever happening again.
So we're not just talking about the Catholic Church.
We're receiving tips not only from people who are reporting about members of the Catholic Church, but also other religious organizations. We've also encouraged people to report non-religious institutional abuse cases. If people have information about abuse, we are encouraging them to report.
All right. Well, how pervasive is this, or was it, or I hope it's not ongoing at the same rate, but maybe it is.
Yeah, there have been, I think, 160 some priests who've been identified by the diocese in Wisconsin as having been credibly accused for abuse. We have asked people to report to us, and we've received reports from people who had previously reported, and we've also received reports from people who'd never reported before. As I mentioned, about 180 people had contacted us as of a few months ago. Those are, in many cases, reports of alleged abuse, but in other cases, providing information about institutional response. And so one of our goals at the end of this is to put out a report summarizing what we've found through the investigation. And our hope is that that's going to shed more light on the nature of the issue that existed in Wisconsin and where things stand now.
And when is that report due?
There's no specific deadline. We are continuing to ask people to submit information if they have it. And if you do want to report to DOJ, you can go to supportsurvivors.widoj.gov. And we're going to follow the facts where they lead. If there are cases where investigation is appropriate, we're going to work with local law enforcement and prosecutors to pursue that. With other cases, if there's information provided to us that, say, is beyond the statute of limitations, but we can gather the facts in a way that helps inform the end product, the report, we're going to do that. And so our commitment is to following the facts where they lead.
All right. Some of the groups who have been pushing for more investigation, continued investigation, well, they blame the perpetrators of the crime, but they also blame the institutions. They blame the church hierarchy or hierarchies, if we're talking about more than the Catholic Church. And I'm wondering, is obstruction of justice for institutions, is that part of it? Because not all institutions have been forthcoming about the abuse within their ranks.
There's a lengthy, public record out there about institutional failures and what's taken place historically. What we're going to focus on for our review is the information that we receive and what those facts mean. And again, we're going to follow the facts wherever they lead. So we're not drawing any conclusions at this point or ruling anything in or out. We're going to keep gathering information, and then based on what the review shows, we're going to proceed as appropriate.
So that's a maybe.
Well, it's that we are continuing to review information, and so we're not going to prejudge any conclusions.
But you're not ruling it out, I guess, right?
Like I said, we're not ruling anything in or out. We are continuing to gather all the facts.
Okay. So let's move on to some other things here. Your plate has been full. I mean, I'm going down the list here. Okay, so now election integrity in the phrasing of Republicans who have been passing bills to change election law. Let's just start with a general question. Does election law in Wisconsin need to be changed?
I'd like to see certain steps taken to expand access to voting in Wisconsin. I think there are ways we can do that in a way that protects the security and safety of our elections. But fundamentally, we have an outstanding system in Wisconsin. Our elections are safe and secure, and the results that we get from our elections reflect the will of the voters. I mean, we've seen challenge after challenge after challenge to the results of the 2020 presidential election. And what those challenges have consistently established is that the results that were reported on election day and the day after reflect the will of the voters. And all these attacks we've seen are really just efforts to artificially undermine confidence in our elections.
So is fraud a problem in Wisconsin?
Well, any case of fraud needs to be investigated and prosecuted, but the number of cases of fraud in Wisconsin is infinitesimal. It is such a small fraction that it's far lower than the margin in almost every election.
So the Legislative Audit Bureau, which is nonpartisan, been respected over the years, came up with some, I would call them administrative fixes or proposed administrative fixes. Do any of those that you agree with?
I think there are some things that they suggested in there that might help clarify issues that are good proposals. There are some things in there that I disagree with. As an example, they suggested considering signature matching on absentee ballots, and that's been shown to be pseudoscience, frankly, and not something that can be conducted by people without specific training in it, and it can lead to votes being wrongly thrown out. But there are elements of the report that I think are worth considering. But the bottom line, I think, from that report is that, like many others who've reviewed our elections, they found that the results from the 2020 election that were reported reflect the will of the voters.
Okay, you've been defending the election commission, I think, right? And not just the administrator. Does the election commission in Wisconsin do a good job, or has it done a good job?
Yeah, I think they've done an outstanding job. We have a really strong history of election administration in Wisconsin. The Government Accountability Board was identified as a model for election administration, and then Republicans in the legislature about 6 years ago decided that they wanted to eliminate that board, and they replaced it with the election commission that we currently have. And one of the challenges with the system we have now is it's 3-3 on the election commission, divided by partisanship, and sometimes that leads to deadlocks. But generally speaking, the commission has done an excellent job of ensuring that our elections are run freely and fairly. And I would add, they have been under incredible attack from Republican legislators with this Gableman investigation. And despite that, they have maintained their professionalism and they're doing the right thing, despite attempts to inject partisanship into their work.
All right, you mentioned Gableman, the former state Supreme Court justice who was paid by the Republican State Assembly to investigate, review the 2020 election. He's advocating a decertification process.
Yeah, I mean, this entire investigation has been a disaster, and I use the word investigation loosely because it it's an investigation in the same way that an InfoWars episode is reporting. It's not a serious effort. And what he has suggested when he talks about decertification, let's talk about what that means, is that the legislature can overturn the will of the voters in a presidential election. That is as anti-democratic as you can get. He is talking about effectively ending democracy for presidential elections in Wisconsin. Fortunately, even Republicans, generally speaking, haven't taken him seriously. But what he has done is laid out a very dangerous path that somebody could try to follow in a future election if they are trying to overturn an election. Frankly, the day that he put out a report saying that the legislature could overturn elections, at that point, Republicans in the legislature should have ended this investigation. They should have done it before, but that is anti-democratic reasoning that he is putting out there, and it's fundamentally contradictory to our system.
All right, what do you make of all these subpoenas? The legislature does have subpoena power. It's kind of been, I think the theory is that he, as an arm of the legislature, can use the subpoena power. Is the subpoena power as being used by Gableman legal in your view?
Not the way he's trying to use it. The legislature does have subpoena power, and I think all, or at least most of the people who've been subpoenaed have been clear that they would be happy to testify before a legislative committee, which is the way that process is supposed to work. But Justice Gableman has insisted on doing this behind closed doors. And what we've seen from Justice Gableman so far is a willingness to distort the record. He recently put out the second interim report claiming that absentee voting rates at certain nursing homes were at 100%. That's already been refuted by the election officials who have the data. I don't want to see him conducting these depositions behind closed doors and then putting his own spin on what happened. I want the people of Wisconsin to be able to hear directly from our election officials about what happened in the election. And the reason that the Gableman investigation doesn't want that to happen is because, as we saw when Megan Wolf testified before the elections committee recently, when people actually hear the facts, they realize that all these conspiracy theories are nonsense and that we in fact have a safe and secure system. I understand that he doesn't want the public to hear that, but that's the way that our system is set up.
Right. Okay. So sort of a general question here. Yeah. Conspiracy theories, I think Democrats dismissing these things, dismissing the people who believe in them. But if you have a system, if you have a state in which, I don't know, 10, 20%, who knows how many percent of eligible voters actually believe this stuff, that's a problem for everybody. How do you convince all those people, hey, your elections are okay, we're doing it right? Because it's so partisanized.
Yeah, I agree with you that it's a problem. And it's a problem that stems from Donald Trump's lies about the election, and then the refusal of elected Republicans to tell the truth about what's happened. And there have been some notable exceptions. Kathy Bernier spoke out about this. Liz Cheney is speaking out about it at the federal level. But by and large, what we've seen is that Republican officials in Wisconsin would rather cling to power than work to protect democracy and do the right thing and call this out for what it is, which is a lie. I don't think anybody watching this thinks that the Gableman investigation or the other efforts we've seen to undo the results of the election would be happening right now if the 2020 election had gone differently. This is not about the way our elections are run. It's about people being unhappy about the election results and trying to take that out on the election officials who are doing their job. And that's not how a democracy works. That's the kind of thing you expect to see in an authoritarian country, where when the result of an election isn't what people in power want, they hold the people who administered the election accountable. That's not right, and it's not consistent with our democracy.
All right. Another case you've been involved in is the Natural Resources Board, and one member's, well, not just him, but the then chair's refusal to vacate his position. This is still in Dane County Court, right?
It's before the state Supreme Court now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
From Dane County, but the state Supreme Court heard argument pretty recently, I think a couple of weeks ago. So we are now awaiting a ruling from the state Supreme Court on that issue. This is This is
So
another
it
example.
skipped the appellate stage and went, is this, okay, so you state your case about Frederick Preen should have left when he didn't because.
The state statutes provide that appointees to the Natural Resources Board serve a fixed term, and his fixed term has ended. Now, sometimes when there is not a replacement appointed, people have held over for a period of time. But what he's doing is trying to stay there indefinitely. Governor Evers has appointed a replacement for that position. The state Senate has not acted. But our argument is that Governor Evers now has the authority to remove Dr. Preen from office because his term has expired. What he's arguing is that until the Senate confirms a new appointee, he could stay there until he decides to leave, possibly, for indefinitely. It could be that they never confirm a new appointee. That's not the way our system is supposed to work. And again, this is another example of efforts to undermine the will of the voters. Governor Evers was elected the governor. The governors appoint members of the DNR board to a fixed term, but he's been blocked from doing that by the approach that Dr. Preen has taken.
Okay, this isn't just affecting the Natural Resources Board, which is the policy arm of the DNR. I mean, this is affecting the Tech College Board, and I think it's affecting the UW Regents, right?
It certainly could. This will have broad implications for state government. And what it would mean if he's successful is that our administrative system would become one where appointees who want to hang on indefinitely have that opportunity and can stop the will of the voters in their decision about who should be the governor from being effectuated. And I hope that the court will agree with us on that issue. I think we've got strong legal arguments, but that's not.
Okay, you were kind of breaking up there. Maybe you just want to say the last thing a little bit. Say it again.
Sorry about that. I was saying we have strong legal arguments, and now we're awaiting a decision in that case.
Right, the state Supreme Court, which is mostly ruled by conservatives, unless Justice Hagedorn switches. So now let's go to the. This seems like small potatoes when it used to be a big deal. The settlement process with the Joint Finance Committee, which is controlled by Republicans, the legislature's Joint Finance Committee, controlled by Republicans, and you have to take your proposed settlements on cases, civil settlements, and run them through the Joint Finance Committee. How's that going?
Well, it's now been more than 3 years, and we still don't have an effective process in place with the Joint Finance Committee, unfortunately. There's actually a court hearing today in Dane County Circuit Court regarding the constitutionality of some aspects of that legislation. But what's been happening is that we've been sending settlements over in certain cases where it's required. And by and large, the Joint Finance Committee has been rubber stamping those. They don't take any testimony. They don't hear from anybody on them. But the danger is that there will be an urgent settlement that needs to happen quickly, and they won't be able to take action in time to get a recovery for Wisconsinites. And what that does is puts significant resources at risk for Wisconsin. So far, we've avoided a calamity, but eventually there will be a situation that arises where a settlement may not be able to go forward because of this. And that's not good for Wisconsin taxpayers, and it's just not a functional system.
Okay, we're going to move some questions submitted in advance from the audience. So here's question 1. Your thoughts on initiating a lawsuit against fossil fuel companies to seek justice and damages for environmental and climate damage in Wisconsin?
As Attorney General, I've worked to strengthen our enforcement of environmental laws in Wisconsin. That is an area that had really been weakened during the prior administration, and we've been effective at doing that. We've rebuilt our environmental enforcement efforts, and we've had a number of judgments. We recently announced a significant lawsuit against Johnson Controls involving PFAS violations. And the approach we have taken is to be serious about enforcing our environmental laws, but to do so in an even-handed way. When it comes to a potential investigation into fossil fuel companies, we would look at that the same way we would any other case, which is, do the facts and the law support an enforcement action? That's one where there are some other states that are currently engaged in litigation and have been. So far, those suits haven't been successful, but we are certainly keeping an eye on what's happening in other states, and ultimately any action we take would be based on the facts and the law.
Okay, so you mentioned the PFAS situation. So your office sued two companies, even though the companies said, well, we have been doing stuff, like, why are we being sued? So why were they being sued?
Yeah, well, first, this contamination, which is a significant PFAS contamination in the Marinette area that has impacted drinking wells, among other things, is also groundwater and surface water. That was first discovered in 2013, but it wasn't reported to the DNR until years later. We've alleged that delay in reporting is a violation of the laws, and we've also alleged that the remediation efforts have not been sufficient. To the credit of Tyco and Johnson Controls, they have taken some steps to address the problem, but they have been unwilling to take certain other steps that our Department of Natural Resources believes need to be taken. We had gotten to a point now where we thought that it was clear that they weren't going to take the additional needed steps, and it was time to bring an enforcement action to make sure that a complete remediation of the environmental harm happens, and that there's a financial penalty as well to deter this kind of conduct, and make sure that companies, when they do violate the environmental laws, immediately report those violations and complete a full cleanup.
Yeah, these seem to be like PCBs. They're everywhere. I mean, they're not just in Marinette County. I mean, French Island in La Crosse, some, Black Earth Creek in Dane County. So, I mean, how do you rate this as an environmental danger?
I think it's a significant danger to clean water, and you're right that we have seen new locations where PFAS has been identified around the state in the last few years. In Marinette, and the activity that Tyco and JCI were engaged in was using a fire technology center to conduct testing. So there was a really large amount of firefighting foam that ultimately led to the PFAS contamination. We've seen similar sources of the contamination elsewhere, but one of the key things in these cases, as was true of the PCB cases, is to identify the source of the contamination. But also, we need to make sure that our water is being tested, and that's been happening over the last several years across the state, so that Wisconsinites know if there is PFAS contamination, because PFAS contamination has been linked to all sorts of adverse health effects, and we need to make sure that we're protecting clean water and protecting the health of Wisconsinites, and testing for PFAS, and then ensuring that there's appropriate steps taken when PFAS levels are elevated is how we go about protecting people's health.
Here's another question from an audience member. What advice would you give local DAs regarding the probable overturning of Roe v. Wade?
Yeah, well, there's a case pending before the U.S. Supreme Court right now in which the state of Mississippi, their AG, has asked the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade. I joined with a number of other AGs in submitting an amicus brief that opposed Mississippi's call for Roe to be overturned. But I think there is a significant chance that the U.S. Supreme Court will overturn Roe versus Wade. If that happens, I think there's going to be significant litigation in Wisconsin over what the law even is. There's an old abortion ban on the books that has been there for, I believe it's over 170 years. So one issue would be whether that goes into effect. There would also be questions about what subsequent legislation means and what impact that has. There would be questions about what the Wisconsin Constitution, what protections that it provides. So I think we're going to see some significant litigation. If that Roe is overturned, we would certainly work with DA's offices and others to provide guidance. But I certainly would discourage any DA or law enforcement agency from enforcing those laws until the litigation is worked out. And even after the litigation happens, my view is that our resources, our investigative resources, our prosecutorial resources, should not be used to investigate or prosecute violations of that abortion ban. That is not a good use of our public safety resources. And I've committed that at the Wisconsin Department of Justice, we will not use our investigative or prosecutorial resources that way. We should be going after drug traffickers and murderers, not going after people for engaging in conduct that was considered to be constitutionally protected and still is to this day, but has been for decades.
All right, here's another question. Your position as a state AG is elected independently. You're an independently elected constitutional officer. Can you identify any situations or cases where you took positions not consistent with that of Governor Evers?
Yeah, I think it's critical that our AG is independent. And so, there are certainly many issues where the governor and I agree, but there are others where we've had different views. Sometimes because, the law required us to take a particular position. So early on in our administrations, the governor asked us to withdraw from the lawsuit challenging the Affordable Care Act. That's a position that I agree with. I thought we should get out of that lawsuit as well. But at the time, the lame duck legislation, in my view, prevented us from withdrawing from that suit. And so we didn't right away. Now, fortunately, there was an order in place blocking that law for a while. And when that happened, we were able to withdraw from that suit. But that's one example. I also didn't agree with the legislation that was passed that allocated the opioid settlement funds the way that it's been allocated. Made that clear, but it was passed by the legislature and signed into law. And we've certainly made requests for items in our budget that were not ultimately reflected in the governor's budget. So there have been areas where we've disagreed, but I also think that the governor has done a great job, and there are a lot more areas where we do agree, and we've worked together in a number of areas, and I've been proud to do so.
All right, here's another question. Can you discuss the importance of passing a, quote, Child Victims Act for Wisconsin to provide a 3-year release of the statute of limitations for childhood victims of sexual assault to take their perpetrator to civil court?
Yeah, some other states have passed laws like that. And what those laws do is they give people an opportunity to come forward if they have claims that weren't brought and bring those claims in court. And what other states have seen is that when those kinds of laws are passed, a number of people come forward. I know that legislation has been proposed in the state legislature, and that I don't believe there's been a hearing held. It certainly hasn't been passed into law. But I believe in Minnesota, for example, passage of that kind of legislation has led to a lot of reporting, and that can help identify people who committed sexual assault so that they can be identified and, if possible, investigated and prosecuted.
Okay, so now maybe some pure political talk. So you're running for re-election. You had your first term, and now you're running for a second term, a second 4-year term. You have 2 opponents on the Republican side. What's your analysis of the debate so far on the Republican side?
Well, there's going to be a very clear contrast for voters in this election. What we've seen from the Republicans running for AG is what seems to be a competition between the two of them to go as far as possible to the extreme far right. I don't think that that's what Wisconsinites are looking for. I think they want an AG who is going to be independent and working to protect public safety, as I think our record demonstrates. But they've both been approaching it in a way that suggests a much more politicized role, where they're pursuing cases based on a political agenda. And I'll give you a couple examples. They both have indicated that they would use the resources of the Wisconsin Department of Justice, if Roe is overturned, to investigate and prosecute violations of the abortion ban. I don't think that is a good use of DOJ resources. They've also talked about investigations into all these conspiracy theories about voter fraud. And again, if there is legitimate evidence of fraud, it should be investigated and there should be prosecutions. But we shouldn't be diverting resources from investigations and prosecutions of drug traffickers and people who commit violent crimes to serve a political agenda like we're seeing with the Gableman investigation.
So, I mean, the Attorney General's office is a big statewide office, but, this year is going to be dominated in media, certainly. The US Senate race, for control of the US Senate, the governor's race, that's on the national radar. How do you break through, or how do you, otherwise, is it as the governor's race goes, so goes your race? Or, I mean, how does that all work?
Well, I think it depends on the year, certainly. And, there are examples where there have been, significant divergence between the AG results and the governor's results. But there's no question that the US Senate race and the governor's race are going to get the majority of the attention in this election. But I also think people recognize that the AG's office has a significant impact on Wisconsinites. And one of the things that I really love about the office is that at a time when there is so much gridlock, federally, we see some of that with the partisanship in Wisconsin. Our office is one that gets things done for Wisconsinites. One of the issues I talked about as a candidate was that lawsuit challenging the Affordable Care Act. We withdrew from that suit and actually joined a brief supporting keeping the ACA in place, and it has remained in place. I talked about the prior administration's handling of sexual assault kits. We have now gotten some prosecutions and convictions from review of cases where DNA matches were identified. And we also fought and succeeded in passing legislation that I hope will prevent a future backlog of untested sexual assault kits. And as I mentioned before, we're in line to recover about $400 million, including $50 million this year for the state to help fight the opioid epidemic. And those kinds of concrete results that are going to make a difference in the lives of Wisconsinites, I think that matters to folks. And, I think that's going to be important in the upcoming election.
So, you took over, what was did you have a big surprise, like, oh man, wow, I can't believe that this was not taken care of, or, too much going to this, I'm going to shift it to that. I mean, what was the big surprise, the big reveal for you when you became AG?
I think at Wisconsin DOJ, there was a lack of effective independent leadership that was focused on the best interests of the people of Wisconsin. And that is something that we have been very focused on providing since I took office. And a good example of that is the state crime labs. There had not been the resources provided for or even asked for that the crime labs needed. And so that's an area where we have worked to strengthen the crime lab to start getting them the resources. Just as an example, the Milwaukee Crime Lab building had been left in not great shape, and we've been working to get a new facility built there. But that kind of lack of oversight causes problems to increase, and working to address those takes a lot of time, and it's something that we have been working to do and will continue working to do.
Yeah, well, talk about that. The crime lab, the Milwaukee facility, I think you said not great shape. I think it was a little more serious than that. I mean, they need a new building, right? And they're getting one.
That's right. We appear to be on track. That process is moving forward with the Department of Administration. But that's something that I prioritized right after we took office, because we want to make sure that our crime lab is able to be effective and continues to be effective long into the future. We're really lucky in that we have incredibly talented forensic scientists in our state crime labs, but we need to make sure that they continue to have the resources that they need to play the important role they do in the justice system.
All right, we've touched on this before, but maybe we'll come back a little bit at it because it is a very political thing. So the lame duck legislature, in Governor Walker is leaving office, the legislature passes measures which both you and the governor say are undermining our constitutional office. I think you, and I didn't even, I think you referenced that this is still in play, that some of the elements of that, of your fighting against these measures are still in play. Yes? Is that what you said before? There's a hearing today?
That's right. There are actually two cases going on right now that relate to aspects of the lame duck legislation. One of them is in a Dane County Circuit Court, and that relates to the authority of DOJ to resolve certain cases without needing legislative approval. And then the other case relates to an aspect of the lame duck legislation that potentially impacts funding for DOJ. And there's no question that has had a big impact on us. There's a significant dispute over funds there, and that has forced us to be really careful about how we expend funds at DOJ. And that one's in Polk County, and the litigation is going to continue, I think, to the appellate court.
All right, so you might say that you got off on the wrong foot with the legislature. It got off on the wrong foot with you. But I mean, there have been some bipartisan things passed. You mentioned I believe the measure to prevent another backlog in the rape kits was a bipartisan effort, and I assume you were a part of that. How are you getting? I mean, are you getting along with some of the Republican legislature? Do you find them to be amenable, or is it a hostile environment?
Well, the approach that I've taken is that I will work with anybody if we can work together to help the people of Wisconsin. But I'm also going to speak out against anybody if they're standing in the way of progress. And the legislation that's going to help prevent a future backlog, I think, is a great example of that. Right after I took office, we worked to develop legislation. We got subject matter experts, prosecutors, crime lab experts, and victim advocates and others to come together to come up with ideas. But we also brought together some legislators, and the lead author for that legislation in both the Senate and the Assembly is a Republican. So we worked together in a bipartisan fashion. That legislation quickly passed in the state Senate, but it was blocked in the Assembly. They refused to hold a hearing on that legislation, even though it had a Republican author, and actually the majority of members of the Assembly had co-sponsored that bill. And when that happened, I spoke out about that. Ultimately it did not pass in the prior legislative session, but in this legislative session, it was able to pass both houses and was signed into law by the governor. So, I think it's critical that we work together where we can to achieve bipartisan solutions. And we've worked with a number of members of both parties on a variety of issues, and we'll continue to do so. But I'm also going to continue speaking out if folks are blocking steps that are needed to help improve public safety in Wisconsin or otherwise to make a positive impact on Wisconsinites.
All right, well, our time is up. Thank you very much, Attorney General Josh Kaul, for taking part in our virtual luncheon. And good luck in the coming months. And we'll be back in touch, I'm sure, on developments in all the cases you're watching. So folks who are tuned in, you can always go to wispolitics.com or subscribe to any of the products to keep track of all these things too. So thank you, Attorney General Josh Kaul. I want to thank our sponsors for this Madison Club event series, of course. Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield, ARP Wisconsin, Walmart, XL Energy, American Family Insurance, and Hush Blackwell Strategies. Remember, you can send a message to info@wispolitics.com to find out how to get our printed directory. If you can also message info@wispolitics.com for any suggestions for future programming. So this is Jeff Mayers from wispolitics.com signing off for today, and we'll see you soon.